Mrs. Eleanor Bryant stepped out of the small grocery store, adjusting her old but neatly pressed coat. The wind was chilly, and she pulled her scarf a little tighter around her neck. At 74, her steps were slower than they used to be, but her mind was sharp as ever. She had just bought a loaf of bread, some fresh vegetables, and a carton of milk, simple things she needed for the week. As she made her way toward the bus stop, a sudden voice called out behind her, "Hey, you, stop right there." Mrs. Bryant turned slowly, surprised. A young police officer, tall and broad-shouldered, was walking toward her with a serious expression. He had one hand on his belt, and his eyes were locked on her like she had done something wrong. Behind him, another officer stood by their patrol car, watching. "Ma'am," the officer said, stepping closer, "I need to check your bag." Mrs. Bryant blinked in confusion. "Excuse me. We got a report of shoplifting. You were inside the store just now, weren't you?" His tone was firm, leaving no room for argument. Mrs. Bryant's heart sank. She had lived in this town for over 40 years, and nothing like this had ever happened to her before. People knew her. She was a retired schoolteacher, a woman who had spent her whole life helping children learn and grow. The very idea of stealing was unthinkable to her. "I don't understand," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I just bought some groceries." "Then you won't mind showing me what's inside your bag," the officer said. People at the bus stop turned to look. A few customers leaving the store slowed their steps. Whispers began. Mrs. Bryant could feel their eyes on her, judging her, assuming things about her. A lump formed in her throat, but she refused to let it show. "I paid for everything in here," she said. "You can check with the cashier." But the officer shook his head. "I need to see for myself." With trembling hands, Mrs. Bryant slowly opened her shopping bag. The loaf of bread, the carton of milk, the fresh vegetables, all neatly packed inside. Nothing extra, nothing hidden. The officer stared for a moment, then looked up at her, unimpressed. "You got a receipt?" he asked. Mrs. Bryant reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the small slip of paper. The officer snatched it from her fingers, scanning it quickly. His partner, still standing by the car, seemed to smirk. "Looks like everything is here," the officer muttered. But instead of apologizing, he gave her a hard look. "Next time, just be careful, ma'am." "Careful of what?" Mrs. Bryant wanted to ask. "Careful of shopping like everyone else. Careful of existing." But she held her tongue. She had learned long ago that some fights weren't worth having. Still, as she watched the officer walk back to his patrol car, something inside her burned. This wasn't right. This wasn't fair. And she wasn't going to let it go. With a steady hand, she pulled out her phone and dialed the one person she knew would understand. Her son. Mrs. Bryant stood still for a moment, her fingers tightening around her phone. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she refused to let it break her. People were still watching. Some looked away when she met their eyes, pretending they hadn't seen anything. Others whispered among themselves, shaking their heads. But no one spoke up. The officer who had humiliated her was now talking to his partner near their patrol car. He laughed at something his colleague said, as if nothing had happened. As if stopping an elderly woman and accusing her of stealing was just another part of his day. Mrs. Bryant took a deep breath. She wasn't the type to cause a scene, but she knew this wasn't right. She had done nothing wrong, yet she had been treated like a criminal in front of everyone. And worse, the officer didn't even seem to care. A woman in a blue jacket hesitated before stepping closer. "Ma'am, are you all right?" she asked softly. Mrs. Bryant forced a small smile. "I'm fine, dear. Thank you." But she wasn't fine. Not at all. A minute later, the officer walked back toward her, still holding her receipt. Instead of handing it back with an apology, he waved it carelessly in the air. "Looks like you didn't take anything," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "This time." Mrs. Bryant's jaw tightened. "This time, What did that mean? He made it sound like she was some kind of troublemaker, as if he had caught her doing something wrong before. I already told you that, she said, keeping her voice steady. The officer smirked. Just doing my job, Mom. He finally handed her the crumpled receipt, but there was no respect in his tone, no hint of regret. Mrs. Bryant looked at him carefully, studying his face. He was young, probably in his late 20s. He wore a uniform with confidence, but there was something else in his expression. A sense of power, of control. Like he enjoyed moments like these, moments where he could make someone feel small. You should be ashamed of yourself, she said quietly. The officer raised an eyebrow. Excuse me. You heard me, she said. I hope one day you understand what it feels like to be treated unfairly. For the first time, he looked slightly uncomfortable. But before he could respond, his radio crackled and his partner called him back to the car. He gave her one last glance before turning away, acting like she wasn't worth another second of his time. Mrs. Bryant let out a slow breath. Her hands were still shaking as she placed her groceries back into her bag. She knew she couldn't let this go. And she wouldn't have to. Because soon, her son would be here. And when he arrived, everything would change. Mrs. Bryant took a deep breath and sat down on the bench near the bus stop. Her hands were still shaking, but she held onto her phone tightly. She had already called her son, Jonathan, and he had answered on the first ring. She didn't have to say much, just a few words. Come quickly, she had said, her voice calm but firm. Jonathan didn't ask questions. He simply said, I'm on my way. Nah. Now, all she had to do was wait. The store parking lot was still busy, people walking in and out, pushing carts filled with groceries. Some had seen what had happened, but most of them went about their day, acting like nothing was wrong. A few people threw her sympathetic glances, but no one spoke up for her. No one had said a word when the officer had embarrassed her in front of everyone. She glanced at the patrol car where the two officers sat, talking casually, not a care in the world. The young officer, Larson, that was the name on his badge, was laughing, probably sharing a joke with his partner. It was like the whole thing meant nothing to him, like her dignity didn't matter. Mrs. Bryant closed her eyes for a moment. She had seen a lot in her lifetime. She had lived through hard times, seen unfairness and injustice, but she had always believed in standing tall. She had raised her son the same way, to never let wrongdoings go unchallenged. She knew Jonathan. He wasn't going to let this slide. A cool breeze passed through the parking lot, rustling the trees nearby. Mrs. Bryant tightened her coat around her shoulders, her mind replaying what had just happened. She didn't understand how someone so young, wearing a uniform meant to serve and protect, could be so careless with his power. A little girl, holding her mother's hand, walked past her and smiled. Mrs. Bryant forced herself to smile back. She didn't want to carry this anger. She had never been a bitter woman. But today, something inside her felt different. Then she heard it. The low hum of an engine pulling into the parking lot. She looked up just as a sleek black SUV came to a stop near the store entrance. The door opened smoothly, and out stepped Jonathan Bryant, her son. Tall, well-dressed, and moving with quiet confidence, he looked around the parking lot before his sharp eyes landed on her. His expression was calm, but there was something unmistakable in the way he carried himself. A quiet strength, a presence that demanded attention. The officers hadn't noticed him yet, but they would soon. And when they did, their world would shift. Because Jonathan Bryant wasn't just anybody, and they were about to find out exactly who they had just messed with. Jonathan Bryant closed the door of his SUV and took a steady breath. His mother sat on a bench near the bus stop, her grocery bag beside her. She looked calm, but he knew her too well. The way she held her hands together, the way her eyes stayed focused on one spot. These were signs that something had deeply hurt her. Jonathan wasn't a man who lost his temper easily. He had spent years learning patience, discipline, and control. As a well-respected civil rights attorney and former federal prosecutor, he had fought many battles in court, defending people who had been treated unfairly. But nothing angered him more than seeing his own mother being humiliated. His eyes moved toward the two officers sitting in their patrol car, still talking and laughing as if nothing had happened. They hadn't noticed him yet, but they would soon. Jonathan straightened his suit jacket and walked toward his mother. "Ma," he said softly. Mrs. Bryant looked up at him, and for the first time since the incident, her face showed relief. "You came quickly," she said. "I had to," Jonathan replied. He sat down beside her, his voice calm but firm. "Tell me what happened." Mrs. Bryant sighed and explained everything. The officer stopping her, searching her bag, making her feel small in front of everyone, and the way he spoke to her afterward, as if she had done something wrong. Jonathan listened carefully, his face unreadable. But inside, his anger was growing. When she finished, she looked at him and said, "I didn't want to call you, but I knew this wasn't right." Jonathan reached over and gently held her hand. "You did the right thing, Ma. And now, I'll handle it." He stood up and turned toward the patrol car. The officers were still distracted, but as Jonathan walked toward them, Officer Larson finally noticed him. At first, the officer glanced at him casually, as if he were just another customer walking by. But then, something shifted in his expression. His body stiffened slightly, and he sat up straighter. Jonathan walked with a slow, steady pace, his eyes locked onto Larson. The officer's partner, Officer Reed, looked up as well, his relaxed posture disappearing. By the time Jonathan reached them, both officers were silent. "Can I help you, sir?" Larson asked, his voice still carrying some of the confidence he had earlier. Jonathan studied him for a brief moment before speaking. His voice was smooth, controlled, but with an unmistakable edge of authority. "You already have," Jonathan said, "by making this serious mistake." Larson frowned. "Excuse me." Jonathan didn't blink. "You see that woman sitting over there?" He pointed toward Mrs. Bryant. "That's my mother." Larson's face lost a bit of its color. Jonathan continued, his tone never rising, but every word hitting like a weight. "And you're about to explain to me why you thought it was acceptable to humiliate her in public, without evidence and without cause." Silence. For the first time, Officer Larson looked uneasy. His partner shifted uncomfortably beside him. The confidence they had earlier was gone. Officer Larson swallowed hard. His jaw tightened as he looked at Jonathan Bryant, who stood tall and calm, but with a presence that demanded respect. The confidence Larson had just moments ago had faded. Something about this man felt different. He wasn't just an angry family member making a scene. He carried himself with the kind of quiet strength that made people listen. Jonathan didn't look away. He had spent years in courtrooms questioning people far more powerful than a local police officer. He knew exactly how to handle moments like this. "I ask you a question," Jonathan said, his voice even. "Why did you think it was acceptable to stop my mother, accuse her without proof, and humiliate her in front of everyone?" Larson cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Sir, I was just doing my job. We had a report." "A report from who?" Jonathan cut in. Larson hesitated. Jonathan nodded, as if he expected that reaction. "You see, I already spoke to the store manager on my way in. And do you know what he told me?" He let the words hang in the air for a moment. "That no one reported any shoplifting." Larson's face turned pale. Jonathan continued, his voice calm but firm. "So, I'll ask again. Why did you stop my mother?" Officer Reed, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. "Look, sir, sometimes mistakes happen. We didn't mean any harm." Jonathan turned to him, his sharp gaze making the officer shift uncomfortably. "Mistakes," he repeated. "You call publicly searching an elderly woman's bag and speaking to her like she was a criminal a mistake?" Reed looked away. Jonathan took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough that only they could hear. "Do you have any idea who you just humiliated?" Larson blinked. "Sir, my mother," Jonathan said, his voice like steel, "is a retired school teacher who spent 40 years educating children in this community. She's lived in this town longer than both of you have probably been alive." Larson swallowed again, his hands tightening at his sides. Jonathan took another step. "And I am a former federal prosecutor and civil rights attorney. Do you know what that means?" Neither officer answered, but their faces told him they understood. "It means," Jonathan continued, "that I know exactly what laws you violated today. And I know exactly what needs to be done next." Silence. Larson's face had gone completely pale now. Even Reed looked nervous. They both knew this wasn't just another citizen they could brush off. Jonathan glanced at his mother, who sat watching quietly, her hands resting in her lap. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her son was handling everything, just as she knew he would. When Jonathan turned back to the officers, his expression was unreadable. "I suggest you call your supervisor," he said, "before I do." The weight of his words hung in the air. Larson didn't move for a second. Then, without a word, he reached for his radio. Things were about to change. Officer Larson hesitated for a moment, his fingers hovering over the radio on his shoulder. His face was tense, his jaw tight. He glanced at his partner, Officer Reed, as if looking for support, but Reed simply nodded at him, silently telling him there was no other choice. Slowly, Larson pressed the button on his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Larson. We need a supervisor at our location." His voice was quieter than before, missing the confidence he had earlier. Jonathan watched him carefully, his face calm but firm. He knew exactly what was happening inside Larson's head. The officer had probably stopped many people before, questioning them without proof, treating them unfairly. But this time, he had picked the wrong person. This time, he was being held accountable. Mrs. Bryant remained seated, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't speak, but her eyes held a quiet strength. She had raised Jonathan to be the man he was today, and she was proud of him. A few minutes later, a second police car pulled into the parking lot. The vehicle came to a stop, and a middle-aged man in a dark uniform stepped out. His name tag read Lieutenant Harris, and from the way he carried himself, it was clear that he was in charge. He walked toward the group, his eyes shifting between Jonathan, his mother, and the two officers. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice serious. Jonathan turned to face him. "Good afternoon, Lieutenant. My name is Jonathan Bryant. I'm a former federal prosecutor and civil rights attorney." He let the words sink in for a moment before continuing. "Your officers stopped my mother, searched her without cause, and treated her like a criminal in public. I've already spoken to the store manager. No theft was reported." Lieutenant Harris' expression changed slightly. He glanced at Larson and Reed, who both stood stiffly, not meeting his eyes. "Is that true?" he asked them. Larson cleared his throat. "Sir, we were just responding to a possible situation." "Did you have any actual evidence?" Jonathan interrupted, his voice sharp. "Or did you just assume?" Larson fell silent. Lieutenant Harris sighed, rubbing his temple. "Mr. Bryant, I apologize for this situation. I can assure you, this is not how we operate." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Because from where I'm standing, it seems like your officers acted without any proof, and when they realized their mistake, they refused to take responsibility." Harris looked uncomfortable. He knew Jonathan was right, and more importantly, he knew this situation could become a much bigger problem if it wasn't handled correctly. "Mr. Bryant," he said carefully, "what would you like to see happen next?" Jonathan's expression didn't change. He had already made up his mind. And in the next moment, he made it clear that this was far from over. Jonathan stood tall, his eyes locked on Lieutenant Harris. The weight of his words hung in the air, unspoken but clear. This wasn't just a minor misunderstanding. It was an act of injustice, and Jonathan was determined to see it addressed properly. First, Jonathan said, his voice calm but firm, "I want an apology for my mother. She was humiliated in front of her community, and no one, should ever be made to feel like a criminal when they've done nothing wrong." Lieutenant Harris nodded, his expression serious. "I understand, Mr. Bryant. I will personally apologize to her, and I will ensure that our officers are properly trained to handle situations like this more carefully in the future." Jonathan's gaze didn't soften. "I appreciate that, but it's not enough. This goes beyond just saying sorry. My mother shouldn't have had to go through this, and neither should anyone else." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. "I want a full review of what happened today, an investigation into the officer's actions, and I want it documented." Harris seemed to consider this, his brows furrowing slightly. He didn't look defensive, but he knew the stakes were rising. This wasn't just a matter of one officer's mistake. It was about accountability, about ensuring that something like this would never happen again. "I'll make sure there's a full report," Harris said, "and I'll personally follow up on it. We don't tolerate this kind of behavior in the department." Jonathan nodded, though he wasn't quite satisfied yet. "Good, but I also want this on record. This isn't about a mistake that can just be brushed under the rug. You're the lieutenant, and it's your responsibility to make sure every officer in your department knows they are accountable for their actions." Harris met his gaze. "I'll make sure that's clear to everyone." Jonathan took a deep breath, his shoulders loosening just slightly. But he wasn't done yet. And finally, he said, "I want the officers involved in this situation to understand the impact of their actions. They need to be held accountable, not just with an apology, but with a lesson. A lesson in treating people with dignity, no matter who they are." There was a long pause as Harris considered Jonathan's words. The air around them was still, and for a moment, even the sound of the cars in the parking lot seemed to fade into the background. "I agree," Harris said quietly. "I'll ensure they understand the gravity of this." Jonathan finally looked at his mother, who had been sitting quietly on the bench. Her calm demeanor had never wavered, and her strength was evident in the way she held herself. She hadn't asked for any of this, but Jonathan knew she felt the weight of it. She was proud of him, but he knew she also wished it had never come to this point. "Thank you, Lieutenant," Jonathan said, his voice softening just a little. "But make sure this doesn't just fade away. My mother and every other person in this community deserve better." Lieutenant Harris nodded once more, then turned to the officers who were standing in silence. The message had been delivered, and as the tension in the air slowly began to ease, Jonathan knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The parking lot slowly began to empty as the last of the customers left the store. The sunlight had started to fade, casting a soft glow across the pavement, and the sound of cars pulling away became the only noise left. Mrs. Bryant stood up from the bench, her hands still resting in her lap, but her posture was straighter, more at peace. She had been through so much in her life, yet this moment had tested her in ways she hadn't expected. But now, as she looked at Jonathan, she felt the weight of the situation lift just a little. "Thank you, Jonathan," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth and pride. Jonathan smiled gently at her. "You don't have to thank me, Ma. I did what any son would do." The officers had left the parking lot after Harris assured Jonathan that the investigation would be handled properly. Jonathan watched them drive away, their patrol car disappearing into the distance. For now, the situation was resolved, but he knew it wasn't over. The department had promised changes, but it was up to the community to make sure those promises were kept. The two of them walked toward Jonathan's SUV in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was something reassuring about the calm that had settled between them. Mrs. Bryant knew her son had done everything in his power to make things right, and Jonathan knew that, no matter what, his mother would always be the woman who had shaped him into who he was today. As they reached the vehicle, Jonathan turned to her. "You're not alone, Ma," And you never will be. She smiled, a soft, knowing smile that only a mother could give. I know, dear. I know. They got into the car, and Jonathan started the engine, pulling out of the parking lot. As they drove through the quiet streets, the weight of the day began to fade. Jonathan's mind still lingered on what had happened, but he knew that for now his mother was safe. The officers would face the consequences of their actions, and the community would take note. But something more important had happened too. This was a reminder of the power of standing up for what's right, no matter how difficult it may seem. Jonathan had fought not just for his mother, but for the integrity of the system, for the values of fairness and justice that so many took for granted. And in doing so, he had set an example, not only for his mother, but for everyone who witnessed the incident. The road ahead was quiet, but Jonathan knew there was still work to be done. This wouldn't be the last time he had to speak up. It was a reminder that sometimes, even the smallest moments can lead to the biggest changes. And as they reached home, Jonathan turned off the engine and looked at his mother. We'll keep pushing for what's right. Together. Mrs. Bryant nodded, her voice steady. Together. And they both knew that, no matter what, they would never back down from standing up for justice.